So some of the kind of underlying idea behind this, some of which is new and some of which isn't. So there's a basic idea that I believe underlies all of the kind of open standards agenda. At one level, we produce something. Okay, it's a bespoke thing, it's expensive, we pay a lot for it, it's risky, and there's only one of them. Okay, it doesn't matter what it is. So electricity, before it became a commodity, a utility, was very much like that. And of course, there's slow development. This stuff is expensive, and we have to pay a lot of money for them to begin with. And as more and more people develop things, obviously we get some sort of platform. Okay, it's not an open platform, but the Apple platform is a good idea. A good example of a genuinely open platform, sort of, is the Google platform. Okay, so far so good. So we're aware that on the kind of right-hand side, we've got, we expect to pay very little for stuff here. It's a platform, and when people know, for example, that if I design a product and I plug it in the wall, it works, in other words, the electricity platform, I'm going to then innovate and produce other stuff that works on that platform. Think about the Apple platform, the closed Apple platform as well. Fair enough. What does that mean for government? And this is what we started to say. Well, actually, it means that rather than outsourcing my entire finance function or HR function in a very undifferentiated way to an organization that's going to say, oh, this looks like a right old mess, we've got loads of variation here, and actually is going to make out that much of this column, this difficult and hard column, is representative across the whole piece. What we actually need to do via open standards is be able to compare apples with apples. We separate out the finance and the mainly in corporate services functions, and we actually realize that if we can standardize around open ways of doing things, standard ways of doing things, much of this becomes handle cranking. Much of this becomes utility. And then, of course, we can turn to our large systems integrators, our technology companies, who at the moment charge us an arm and a leg for these undifferentiated outsourcing contracts, and we go, don't you come here and tell me that this stuff is difficult, because we've already leaned the hell out of this stuff. This is a commodity service. You can bid for this commodity service, or you can bid for these services down here, okay? If it's a commodity service, if I'm the chairman of IBM, for example, I'm worried at the moment, because in the future, in the past, I've been able to charge for margin and volume. So I've charged high margins across all of this work. In the future, I've got a choice. Either I do the handle cranking here, or I'm kind of increasingly boxed into small sub-verticals. Either way, I have to sack a great quantity of my staff, and that's a real threat for the business model. Unfortunately, it's also a threat for many traditional, similarly vertically integrated business models within the public sector as well. Okay, so the kind of economics of this is it punishes idiosyncrasy, and it punishes vertically integrated ways of doing things which ignore the economics of the emerging utility marketplace. Okay, and so what are the kind of consequences for public sector? Well, we need to think about differentiating increasingly between types of services. We need to think about different procurement models against those. We need to think about different organizational designs, different skill sets, because increasingly we need all three of these capabilities in the public sector, not just one. So there's some real thinking about that needs to go on, and real people who understand what their different activities are. We stop, for example, blending lean approaches and agile approaches, because they're utterly different. Agile belongs down here, lean belongs over here. And within government, at a kind of high level, we need to really think about ways in which we do things all over the place. Okay? I'm not going to dwell on that bit at the moment, because I think that's probably a bit high level. In the way in which it works, we're saying this. Politicians up here worry about open government or whatever other mantra they want to think about. For us, however, this stuff is only going to happen with culture change from delivery to commissioning. That is only going to happen if we start to think about service outcomes and practices. That is only going to happen if we can compare apples with apples, if you like. Okay? Because if we can't compare the price for one set of services to another, we can't drive through that commoditization model. That's only going to work with open standards and common components, and then, of course, we get more technical at the bottom. That was my original attempt at explaining how this stuff works. It also sits at the top of the strategic implementation plan. You can see the version here. And what's depressing about it for me is you can see how difficult this stuff is, because even the phrase culture change from delivery commissioning was watered down by the Cabinet Office to say innovative ways of working and strengthen governance. Even the phrase service-driven procurement and models and practices was watered down to say commercial models and practices. No, that was not what was meant. Okay? And so there are some real difficulties trying to push through some of the implications of some of these ideas at a high level. For transformation projects, those that actually take open standards seriously, there are a bunch of different activities which look a little bit different to some of those ones that we're used to. Many of us are used, for example, to channel shift. We understand why at some level we need to shift towards automated modes of service delivery, but are we really ganging up together to think about how we can commoditize those, potentially at national level, okay? And really the kind of crux of the movement that we need to make is this in our transformation programs. At the moment, and ignore these acronyms, but this basically means where we are at the moment. This is picked up in my paper, and this means where we need to get to on the left. Okay, so where we are at the moment is we standardize on our suppliers. We're an Oracle shop, for example, so we run Oracle. Therefore, we're locked in for 10 years to an Oracle contract. We all know standard process in ERP is you don't muck around with the technology, you customize your processes around that. You customize your service outcomes, and your technical standards are to suit your strategic choice as supplier. So we're focusing on the wrong stuff. We're focusing on inputs, we're focusing on solid things, solid structures, and we've lost control over a kind of consistent way and understanding of what our business outcomes are and what we're here to do. In contrast, we've got to go over here. We've got to say, we don't care who you are and what technology you use. We are going to standardize our business rules, our business outcomes, not our technology, and we're going to chop them up into small parcels, some of which will be more expensive and some of which will be cheaper. And we're going to run those, and we don't care who you are and what you do, but they've got to conform to some high-level open standards, okay? And as a result, we're going to move to a consumption model here on the bottom right. So that's a massive shift in procurement, in understanding of business processes, as well as technology open standards right across government to actually enable this stuff to happen. And for me, unless transformation is answering some of those questions, unless it helps you to move you from the right-hand side of this quadrant to the left-hand side, it's probably a waste of time. Unless at some level we start to move from clustering around technology suppliers, so this might be, I have no idea, nothing against them, but SAP, this might be Oracle, this might be for something else, it might be Northgate. Instead of clustering around those, okay, we have to disintegrate, standardize, and recluster ourselves around service outcomes, okay? So that's a kind of a model for really the kind of disintegration, the way in which government has to change from a vertically integrated traditional model to a different one. Picking up on the same logic, rather than, there are various various service delivery configurations organizations are looking at. None of these things on here will be new, but what potentially is new is that most organizations have no really consistent way of actually arriving at these various decisions. And what I'm saying is, always apply this logic, okay, so that you become a component trader. The dedicated stuff, the difficult stuff, you might want to partner and keep that closer in-house. The more utility stuff, the transactional stuff, is going to be right out here. And again, moving from a kind of fixation on stuff, on structures, to but without much clear idea as to how you take those commercial decisions, to a fixation on being very clear about what you're paying for and why, and much more flexibility about the structures you end up with. And then there are some potentially interesting things that you can start to do about building your organization around those three different types of skill sets, as I mentioned earlier. And then obviously there's the idea that we transition around with a kind of technical focus is in some ways, it's totally indistinguishable from many of the kind of very kind of key business transformation ideas we need to be looking at as well. And all the way, of course, we're transitioning from a vertically integrated way of doing things traditionally to one which is much more platform-based again. Quick example, how might that look? Social care, applying the same model in the future, let's say 10 years hence, potentially, these various components of social care might be out in the cloud. They might be free, I should think. If I'm a chief exec and somebody in social care comes to me, a social care manager, I'm going to want to know these bits, these chips, if you like, these components are being pushed out to the cloud. These bits are being shared with other similar organizations because the market hasn't yet got mature enough to provide them as a utility. And only these bits, possibly the face-to-face expensive bits, are being done in-house. Similar example for revs and bends. That requires a kind of component-based architecture, but it also requires government to actually take a little bit of control in terms of building that platform. So, for example, we can look across the organization at Service A, componentize it. Service B, componentize that. So again, to split it into these various components. Service C, and in this generic idea, obviously it doesn't take a genius to work out, there's a clustering of payments horizontally across the organization, okay? And you can particularly do this for corporate services. What I would like to see is government doing this, okay? In my view, there is no reason why there should not be, if you like, a multi-tenanted platform for standard business rules that do for business rules what Amazon did for web hosting, okay? Why on earth do we pay hundreds and hundreds of times over in this country for very, very standard stuff? There is no reason whatsoever. The danger is, however, by tackling these things again and again and again in our little transformation programs, we're still going to end up wasting years and years and years, when in fact, my view is we should almost start again. Government needs to actually market make, to educate, to build a platform, and to start to think about a central architecture or platform for some of these more standardized things. I believe we could save billions of pounds, not just hundreds of millions, but billions of pounds by doing this long term. But obviously, this stuff is relatively explosive, and I think the political case absolutely needs to make. I don't think government, at some level, really understands what it needs to do, what the role of the centre is in doing that. I won't dwell on this stuff, but this is a highly critical report I did for the Public Administration Services Committee. If those of you who keep up with these things will recall that last year it was called a recipe for rip-off, government IT, which means we've moved quite a long way from where we used to be 3 or 4 years ago. Government's response to what they were going to do about it still didn't really engage with the kind of strategic questions I've been posing here today. And I believe actually there's a real market out there, if you like, for 1 or 2 people to try and help explain to politicians and to pull the Cabinet Office along a little bit more in terms of what that master plan is. Okay, what is that relationship between localism and a kind of central platform and open standards, and how does that work for the future? Big barriers, just to finish off in the way. I think we're going to need a bit of legislation. There's all sorts of people rushing around talking about cloudish. G-Cloud, I think, in many ways is a daft idea. Okay, cloud means, quite simply, utility economics, like electricity. Putting G in front of it means, well, that's a special government enclave of utility economics. So basically it means special, not special. It's literally an oxymoron. It literally makes absolutely no sense. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding right there, and I think that's set us back in UK PLC for quite a while. We've got to tackle the fondness for being different. Obviously, what I often hear around the place is, well, this sounds fantastic, really dynamic, really innovative. Where's it been done before, and how can I have one without any risk? And we need to kind of think about the role of the centre in terms of actually making that happen. How on earth is this stuff really going to come together? Okay, I believe it has to come together at national level, and I do believe that there is compatibility between the localism agenda and some sort of national coordination. Okay, quite a lot to get through, but I'm hoping again it is the kind of role of the academic to shake a few things up and ask a few questions. But I think it's a long way to go. Massively exciting times, and very exciting time to be thinking about this kind of stuff at the moment. Thanks very much.